Nobody told Whitney Houston it was going to be like this. She knew Madonna would be there. Everyone knew. The whole city knew. When Arsenio Hall booked both women on the same night in the fall of 1992, the phones at the production office didn't stop ringing for a week. Journalists wanted credentials. Radio stations ran countdowns. One tabloid headline simply read, "Tonight, two queens, one stage," as if it were a boxing match, as if someone had to lose. Whitney read that headline in her dressing room and set it down without a word. If you subscribe to this channel, you already know Whitney Houston was not a woman who chased drama. That was never her game. Drop a comment below and tell us. Did you watch that night live? Because what happened in that studio is still being talked about more than 30 years later. The world in late 1992 was a specific kind of loud. Madonna had just released Erotica in the Sex Book in the same week, and the cultural explosion was unlike anything the entertainment industry had seen. She was everywhere. Magazine covers, talk show couches, the lead story on every evening news broadcast that dared to cover her. She had figured out something that most artists never crack: how to make the conversation about you before the music even plays. She walked into every room already winning. Whitney, on the other hand, was in a different kind of moment. The Bodyguard hadn't opened yet. The soundtrack was about to drop, but nobody outside the inner circle knew what was on it. She was coming in quieter than usual, more internal. People who knew her well said she seemed like she was carrying something. Not trouble, more like weight. The kind of weight that comes right before something enormous happens, and you're the only one who can feel it coming. She arrived at the studio 2 hours before taping. No entourage flooding the hallways, no chaos, no demands. She sat in the makeup chair and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time without speaking. Her stylist later said it was the quietest she'd ever seen her before a television appearance. Not nervous, just still. Down the hall, the energy was entirely different. Madonna's arrival was an event in itself. The production staff had essentially doubled in size just to accommodate the coordination. Her team moved through the building like a current, and she moved at the center of it, laughing, redirecting, already performing even before the cameras were on. She was brilliant at this. Genuinely brilliant. The ability to command a space before you've done anything in it is a rare skill, and Madonna had spent years sharpening it into something close to an art form. One of the producers knocked gently on Whitney's dressing room door around 6 o'clock. He poked his head in to check on her. Whitney was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. He assumed she was resting. He didn't know she was praying. She did that before every performance. Had done it since she was a little girl, singing in New Hope Baptist Church in Newark. Her mother, Sissy, watching from the front row, with an expression that said, "You were built for this, now go prove it." Nobody builds a voice like Whitney Houston's on talent alone. They talk about the range, the power, the technical perfection, and yes, all of that was real. But what made her different wasn't the instrument. It was the theology behind it. Whitney genuinely believed her voice was not hers. She believed it was given to her for a reason, and that every time she opened her mouth in front of people, she owed them something true. Not impressive, true. That belief was also, quietly, the source of her greatest anxiety. Because what happens when the world starts treating your sacred thing like a product? By 1992, Whitney had been the biggest female artist in the world for nearly a decade. She had won every award. She had sold more records than almost anyone alive. And somewhere inside all of that, a small, quiet voice kept asking a question she didn't know how to answer. Is any of this still about the music? She never talked about that publicly. Whitney Houston did not air her interior life on television. She smiled. She was gracious. She was professional. But those closest to her knew that behind the composure was a woman working hard to stay connected to something she felt slipping. Madonna was not the villain of this story. That's the thing about the narrative the tabloids constructed that night. It was wrong, or at least incomplete. She didn't show up to the Arsenio Hall show to dominate Whitney. She showed up to do what she always did. Fill the room completely, because that was the only way she knew how to exist in a room. There was no calculation against Whitney in it. It was just Madonna being Madonna, which was, by any measure, a considerable force. but the effect on the evening was the same regardless of intent. By the time taping began, the studio audience was oriented entirely around Madonna. The energy in the room had a direction, and it pointed at her. She was funny and sharp, and impossible to look away from. Arsenio was delighted. The audience was hanging on every word. It was objectively a great television moment, the kind of conversation that makes people lean toward their screens. Whitney sat at the other end of the couch and watched. She wasn't sulking. She wasn't performing patience either, which can look the same but isn't. She was genuinely quiet in the way that people are when they've decided something. Her hands were still in her lap. Her back was straight. She answered questions when Arsenio turned to her, briefly, warmly, without reaching for the spotlight. A few people in the audience later said they almost felt sorry for her. That's how complete Madonna's gravitational pull was that evening. Then Arsenio said, "Whitney, you want to give us something?" It wasn't even a formal introduction. It was almost an afterthought, the way you might ask a friend to play something on the piano at a party, tucked at the end of a long night. The band shifted. Someone handed her a microphone. She stood up. She closed her eyes. What happened in the next 60 seconds is genuinely difficult to describe in words, which is maybe why people have been trying for 30 years. She didn't do anything dramatic. She didn't walk to the center of the stage or ask for a key change or take a moment to compose herself. She just stood there, closed her eyes, and when the music found its opening, she sang. The first note landed in that studio like something physical, not loud. That's the thing nobody who wasn't there quite believes. It wasn't a wall of sound. It was more precise than that. It was a single note with so much intention behind it that the room's entire atmosphere changed in the span of a breath. The audience, which had been buzzing and loose and warm in the way television audiences are when they're having a good time, went completely silent. Not politely quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when something cuts through all the noise and reminds you that you're a human being capable of being moved. Madonna turned her head. There are photographs from that taping, and in several of them you can see the exact moment. Her body is still turned toward Arsenio, but her face is angled toward Whitney, and her expression is doing something complicated. It's not envy. It's not even pure admiration. It's the look of someone who has spent their entire career mastering how to command a room, suddenly watching someone do it with none of the machinery. No concept, no provocation. Just a woman and a note, and 30 years of believing that the voice is not yours to keep. By the third bar, 2 people in the audience were already crying. A camera operator later said he had to remind himself to keep shooting because his instinct was just to stop and listen. Whitney didn't open her eyes once. She sang those 16 bars like she was the only person in the building, like the cameras weren't there, like the audience wasn't there, like the entire apparatus of the entertainment industry that had been packaging and selling and debating her for a decade had simply ceased to exist for 60 seconds. There was a directness to it that felt almost confrontational, except there was no aggression in it. It was just the truth. Raw, unhurried, enormous. When she finished, the silence held for one more second before the room broke completely open. The applause was different from the applause earlier in the evening. Earlier, it had been enthusiastic, the normal warm response of a good crowd at a good show. This was something else. This was the sound of people applauding because they didn't know what else to do with what they just felt. Arsenio stood up. The band, several of whom had been playing professionally for decades, looked at each other like they weren't entirely sure what had just happened to them. Madonna started clapping slowly, then faster, and then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one. The kind that escapes you when something is so far outside your expectations that your body doesn't have a more dignified response available. She leaned toward Arsenio and said something. The microphones didn't catch it, but Arsenio nodded and his expression said, "Yeah, I know." Years later, in an interview that didn't get nearly enough attention, Madonna was asked about Whitney Houston's voice. She paused for a long time before answering. Then she said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She said, "I've worked with the best vocal coaches, the best producers, the best engineers in the world my entire career. And Whitney just breathes. That's the difference. I work at it, she breathes." There's an honesty in that statement that says more about both women than any rivalry narrative ever could. Madonna built one of the most durable careers in the history of popular music through sheer force of will and relentless reinvention. That's real. That's earned. But she was also clear-eyed enough to recognize that night in the Arsenio Hall studio that she was watching something that lived in a different category entirely. Not better, not worse. Different in the way that a master carpenter and a redwood tree are different. One is skilled, one is something else. Whitney Houston walked back to the couch and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She smiled at something Arsenio said. She was gracious and warm and completely, utterly calm, as if she hadn't just rearranged the molecular structure of every person in the room. The Bodyguard soundtrack came out 3 weeks later. I Will Always Love You spent 14 weeks at #1 and became the best-selling single by a female artist in history. None of that surprised the people who were in that studio on that Tuesday night in November. They already knew. They'd heard it in 60 seconds. But here's what gets lost in the mythology of that moment, what the highlight reels and tribute specials tend to skip over. Whitney Houston walked out of that studio without telling a single journalist what she'd done. She didn't call her publicist. She didn't give a quote. She got in the car, stared out the window, and said almost nothing until they reached her door. She wasn't performing modesty. She just genuinely didn't think she'd done anything that required comment. She'd sung. That was all. That was always all it ever was to her. That gap between what the world saw in those 60 seconds and what Whitney felt she'd simply done is maybe the most revealing thing about her. It's what made her irreplaceable, and it's what made it so difficult in the years that followed to protect the thing inside her that made those 60 seconds possible. The voice was never the hard part. The hard part was everything that came with it.